This conference will now be recorded.
All right, it is 10:01, so we are going to go ahead and get started. There are still people joining our session, but hopefully they'll make it in very shortly. But we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So good morning, everyone. My name is Marcia Gedke, and I'm the president of the Titusville Area Chamber of Commerce and part of the Brevard team that was working on a in-person St. John's River to Sea Loop Summit and has now flipped this to a virtual series of sessions. We thank you so much for hanging in there with us and participating in spite of all of the health challenges and all of that kind of stuff. So hopefully everyone is staying home and staying well. And I'm super excited about today's presentation because it is our keynote presentation for this series, and looking so forward to hearing what Dan Burden has to say. But I do want to make sure that we give a shout out and a quick reminder that we do have a tremendous amount of support for this event when it was in person and has sustained through this virtual platform. And so I want to give a huge shout out to all of our sponsors and the organizers of this program. And in particularly, I want to thank the St. John's River to Sea Loop Alliance and Maggie for entrusting us with the summit and allowing Titusville and Brevard County to host this year's activity and event. So, but I would like to move to, let me see, oops, sorry. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time talking because I know that you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear our guest presenter, and I'm super excited to welcome Dan Burden. And I'm going to turn over presentation capabilities to him and just say that I think I'm a latecomer, a little bit of a latecomer to the trail enthusiasm train, but I'm fully hooked, and I'm so excited, having read about Dan's background and just the limited amount of time I've had to communicate with him through all of this. And I want to start out by thanking him for being so incredibly flexible with us. And I'm sorry that when you were here in town, we weren't actually able to meet in person, but I look forward to hearing what you have to say today. And so hopefully, Dan, you have presentation abilities and can unmute your mic. You're unmuted now, and you can share your screen and take it away.
Fantastic, and good morning, Florida. It's what, 3-hour time zone, so I'm just watching the sun come up over here. But yeah, I want to give you a little bit of background of my work in Florida and a little bit of depth on the work that I've done nationwide with bicycle touring and with all of development of active transportation. So I am assuming my screen is now up. Is that correct, or do I need to?
I'm not seeing it yet. You have to hit the button. There's a little screen button at the bottom that you should be able to hit, and it should share your screen.
I'm going to do that right now. Share. Hopefully, everyone can now see the lead slide. Is that correct?
It is. Can you guys see it? Shake your
Florida.
head. There. Oh, wait. We're making some changes here. Can you guys see it? I'm not seeing it.
I can see it, Marcia. I see an intro slide, yes.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, we're all learning how this new world works. So we're going to get good at this. It's going to be many months that we're going to rethink our country, our states, our communities, and even the streets we live on. But I want to start out with a question for everyone, and this should be advancing. For whatever reason, I'm not getting it to advance. It was working before. Let's see if this, okay, good.
Yeah.
I think we're fine now. So a question for everyone listening in today, to think back when you were 8 years old and consider how far you could travel on your own with either friends or brother or sister, but not an adult. And if you don't mind, in the chat portion, enter what that distance was. And then I want to tell a story as you're entering that information. This is a recent, I'd say in the last 10 years, map of how far people were able to travel at particular years. So on the bottom, the great-grandfather George at age 8 in 1919 was allowed to walk 6 miles to go fishing. That was ordinary for, certainly for a male. If you skip up to the grandfather Jack, at age 8 in 1950, he was able to walk about a mile on his own to his own woods. Go all the way up to the top. Mother, Vicky, at age 8 in 1979, was allowed to walk to her swimming pool, which is about a half a mile away. But now, her son Ed, at age 8, is only allowed to walk to the end of his street, about 300 yards. So the question I wanted to start out with is, what changed? Now, this is in London. In the US, I'm finding that with many audiences I've worked with, these distances are even shorter. Although at one time, and thinking back to your childhood, you were able at age 8 to own your city, essentially. I want to set a stage for what I'd like for folks to get out of today's presentation. Most important is to rebuild our economy and provide a much better pathway to health. We are not set up for that. In fact, we're set up for failure on both counts. And to also build a sustainable, and I'll add in resilient, urban and rural places so that future mega events like the virus are not going to knock us for a loop as much. That we should also make active transportation the easy, natural choice. This should have always been, but sadly we lost that. I'll explain why. And I also want to get into some basic principles on why we must go beyond just trails and supporting bicycling, why we've got to do a very significant change in how we look at towns, cities. Very important to not any longer squander the resources of the generations to follow us. We've got to stop that, and we've got to stop it as soon as we can. And finally, and the pandemic has done this, to develop a sense of urgency. We have an opportunity now, because we're all reminded of how astray we went, of how important this is going to be. But I'm going to build on the whole notion of what the real estate market has already shifted to. It's very important to understand that right at 80% of every home buyer out there, or all home buyers out there, now want to live in walkable neighborhoods, and active transportation being easy, seamless switching from modes. But only 14% of neighborhoods are built that way, and I would say the percentage in Florida is even less. So in this presentation, I'm going to get into a number of concepts. They're all laid out here, and I think this is my prime desire, is to broaden the discussion, show where trails come in and where economics are important, but to shift the gears of what our thinking is. And I'm going to build that upon recreation still being very important, especially in Florida, that we've got to redefine access through transportation, what mode choices we have, how easy it is to shift, but now to focus on transportation equity. Hold on one second, I've got to do something with my screen, or just shift to a different screen. Sorry, just a computer glitch. Is it working now, folks? Can everybody see the full screen? Somebody give a
Yes,
nod.
it's working. It's working.
Oh, good. And here's a very important one, that those who are on the front line right now, many of them are the bottom third of our earners, the folks that take care of us. And this includes the entire service industry, all those on the front line of our workforce, all of transportation, housing, and everything we do in the future, they get covered first. Make sure they don't have to travel long distance from wherever they can afford to live to drive in to take care of whatever basic services Americans need. I'm also going to focus on the whole health picture and then get into the tourism, and this really builds in trails on economic development. And I think there's some wonderful surprises about the economy based on this. And then why we need our cities to be social places, a different way of thinking about it, but the need for people to interact is growing, not dwindling as a result of the coronavirus. And then finally, develop that economic stability and growth, and especially in Florida, to make our decisions to be an age-friendly place. A background on my interest and how I entered this portal to what I do. Way back when I was in high school, I dreamed of bicycling the world. It was the only thing on my mind. I never figured out what career I wanted ever. Just kind of fell into it. But because of my timing, when I developed this interest, I've been able to be one of the pioneers, one of many now, who has really come to understand the full gestalt of what cities are about, but it came in through the bicycling picture. I was very fortunate because my dream did come true. I put together a concept to bicycle from Alaska to Argentina, led the expedition, published in National Geographic. For those of you who keep copies of old National Geographics, it's May 1973. And a very unique opportunity. My wife, Liz, and June and Greg Seipel were the folks that led that expedition. It was significant, and I think it shaped the rest of my life. We were in places where we wouldn't see a car for as long as 2 days, and we might look out on a scene like this and not see any smoke from any cabin or any sign that anyone lived here. This is in the Yukon Territory, the top of the world highway. Later, we dreamed up the idea to celebrate the nation's bicentennial in 1976, and did that to give America a permanent gift to develop the Trans-America Trail. My wife laid it out. It goes through 9 distinct geographic provinces. That trail was a phenomenal success. But what really taught me so much, and I think it really introduced in my career, is the staff we attracted. In time, we had a staff of 30, additional staff part-time of 30, and then hundreds that worked out in the field. And we did this with hardly any money at all. The average staff, no one on the staff earned more than $300 a month, but everyone was guaranteed that. And we became what was known as a great group. And we pulled off something that no one had ever pulled off in history. And that gave me the confidence and the knowledge and the skill set to go to the next level in my own career. I was hired in 1980 by then Governor Bob Graham to be the leader of transforming the Florida DOT. We became the first state in the nation to have a pedestrian bicycle coordinator in combination, a title I created for myself. and remained in that position for 16 years during the early development years to introduce a much broader way of thinking by transportation leaders. To stick with the tourism a little longer, I was asked to put together an event to take about 550 Americans in the end to Australia to celebrate their bicentennial. This was in 1988, and at the time we did this, we were accommodating the very largest group of Americans ever to be in one group until the Olympics. It was quite a phenomenon, and gave me added respect for how strong and important it is to build bicycling in. I now want to focus on where we are. This is, as anyone viewing here can see, a message to walk. And yet, in this scene, even though there are sidewalks and bike lanes, no one is walking. And this is what we've done to ourselves. If you, as a motorist, single occupant vehicle, hit this stream because of the lifestyle we've adopted and the systems we've built, you're going to remain in that queue for about 20 minutes before you get past. This is the final approach to the high school in Maui. It's important to recognize that if we only build for one type of transportation to succeed, that system fails as well. We've got to be more robust in our thinking and build for all. So the important thing that I've learned to focus on, and fortunately many thousands now do, is to stop designing our cities for cars. Just stop it. And now design our cities for people. You still accommodate the cars, but the point is you bring back health, you bring back a sound economy, and everything starts to work. That brings us up to today, a recent picture of San Francisco. Nothing moving other than I see one motorcycle and way off in the distance, perhaps 4 or 5 cars. This is what our cities have become during the pandemic. My hope and my push is that coming out of the pandemic, we stop the silliness and start building our communities around people first, and then accommodate the car. This will rebuild our economy. I think it's very important to point out that we have the inventiveness, we have the skill sets as Americans to pull this off. But what we really need to focus on is we aren't likely in the next 10 or even 20 years to have this kind of an opportunity again. This is a message that I think we are hearing, but we have to act now and make sure that what we build in the future is resilient, healthy, and economically viable. So you will see in this presentation a focal point on health. From here on out, I know everyone's going to be thinking a little more about what is a healthy lifestyle. Do we have the kind of facilities on the ground where we can be active? We don't. And what do we build from here on out? I think it's also important to point out we are the largest nation in the world in more than one respect, but when it comes to health, to be the most obese population in the world, and we're getting fatter as we go along. This is a compounding factor for why Americans are not well positioned to deal with a pandemic. And again, getting back to the basic core or structure of what we do is going to be important. As a reminder, when we think about a life cycle, walking is what we first do to move, to go from one spot to another. Maybe by the age of 7, many of us are already bicycling, but walking is becoming more predominant. And it's not until maybe the age of 16 or 17 where driving comes in. But and even then, a large part of our population never developed the economics or other resources to be able to drive. And then we get into our older years. I'm now 76, and I rely very heavily already on walking and biking for most things. I can still drive. And then here's the cool thing to be aware of. The average American, if you're female, you're going to outlive your ability to drive a car by about 6 years. But if you're male, that number jumps to around 12 years. So how do we get more people to be able to have the choice of multiple forms of transportation? What's very interesting to me is that where about 7% of bicyclists, many of you on this call, are comfortable with all kinds of conditions and you go out and you ride no matter what. Well, there's the enthusiastic and confident, if the conditions are right, will. But the great bulk of Americans that would like to use bicycles for transportation, we have not built the system that would accommodate them. So a little bit on that in this presentation. I think it's important to point out that everything we do is got to be based on what we value, what we care about the most. And we're hearing that people do want to walk, they do want to bike, but that is, again, not the system that we've been building. Florida may be the very first state to have introduced the notion of completing our streets to make them for all modes, all times. And that would be in the state legislature as early as 1980s. And later, nationwide, the term to complete our streets has become much, much more universal and popular. But I want to point out that Florida was way ahead of the nation when we went through the legislative process and made the declaration that we would be building streets for all. What does a system that would support all walking, biking look like? We go to Vancouver to see a protected bike lane, sometimes referred to as a cycle track. And notice, and I love this, that if you think of the number of people walking and biking, they far outnumber the motorists in this scene. Vancouver is a city that has really reinvented itself around people first. Indeed, when they come to transportation monies, number one expense is for walking. Number two, for bicycling. Number three, for transit operations. Number four, for freight. And then finally, for supporting single occupant travel, they're right at the bottom of what's allocated for budget. So I want to talk a little bit about the multiple benefits of building our communities with an infusion of trails and greenways, and really get into the economics. And this is a shared presentation I just before the travel shutdown had presented to North Carolina. Florida has a much broader and a greater need, I think, than any other state. We have more issues to deal with, certainly a much broader span in ages. And so I'm going to, in this presentation, try to unfold how we accommodate and design for the eldest among us, the youngest among us, and then that will in turn serve all people in all other age groups. Next, I'd like to set a stage for how we ended up where we are. It didn't happen by chance. And I want to point out that William Phelps Eno, the father of modern transportation, who did his work in the early 1900s, who, by the way, could not conceive of doing anything in transportation where we weren't already providing for pedestrians, equestrians, and bicyclists. This was core or basic in his studies, 1929. And it's interesting, he was an extraordinarily wealthy person from a family. He ran shipping industries, but he never once drove. He was always driven. But he realized after a play one night, when traffic in New York City just couldn't move, largely all the plays were letting out at the same time. He's the one who invented the stop sign, the pedestrian crosswalk, traffic circles, roundabouts we think of today, the one-way street, taxi stands. And his early concepts for these was very well thought through and well founded. But then we strayed. The big change came with the invention of what we refer to as modernism. It's an architectural way of looking at things. It was introduced in the World's Fair, Chicago, I believe, and it was a people-focused way of looking at cities. Very sad, but it became the way to build, and very pervasive throughout all strata, all professions in our country. And I think it's important to point out that where Hitler and others in Germany were believers in modernism and did many things to further it, if we look at all the bombs that were dropped in World War II and all the other devastation, what modernism has done to our country has had more impact over time than anything done during World War II. Even as recently as in 2008, we're hearing this message. Here you see it expressed by Post magazine in 1930. And some of the quotes from those years: to build cities where we separate people out from streets. And even recently in 2010, from I think it was Drivers Magazine, saying that if we're going to be able to drive in the future, that we have to design the cities to be car friendly. So this is very deep seated. I think it's important to point out, though, we now need to go back to the traditional way of building cities, the way cities were being built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and were the only way to build cities around people. We've done that. You can see it in a Florida city here, Old Town, Key West, which works wonderfully. People go there, park the car, may even forget where they parked it when they're ready to leave. But that's not how all of Key West was laid out. And indeed, I always like to point out that this was designed by people who did not have a college degree, pirates. But what we have built with modern guidelines, the streets don't drain. What do you do with maintenance? We're not taking care of the facilities that are out there. What do you do if you get off of the bus? How do you get back to where all the services are? And what in the world is this center arrow for? This is what happens when we develop the guideline for the car. We make it impractical for all. We've also led to other conditions that we are now going to have to address. The car-centric focus makes our key neighborhoods, the places where we live, places of isolation. And this is as recent as 2005. This was still being celebrated as the plan for the new America. Florida is, I like to say, and I think I'm pretty correct on this, the toughest state to bring back because so much got built where we made it physically impossible for people to walk or even take a simple bike ride to stores and parks and other things through our zoning and other applications. We simply are going to have a long road to hoe to get ourselves out. But let's talk about what we now must focus on. At our very heart, our very core, what people want, they've always wanted and needed, is places to just hang out, to bump into other people, maybe without a handshake in the future, who knows? But the point is we need to socialize, we need to feel connected to communities, and this means over time, lots more true face-to-face contact, not doing it through a drive-in window. It's also important to point out that what we have developed in the past, the current code for most communities is a very poor performer. If we look at the yield per acre, you have an acre of land and you build what's on the left, which we have mostly now, versus what's on the right, a mixed-use village, you're only gaining a small percentage of the true value of the land. In the future, we must build mixed-use walkable places. And notice here, 800% increase in the return on the investment. This is core once we start designing for people and stop designing everything around the car. It's also important in this presentation to point out there's no single entity to blame. Whether we're talking about those who are paving the way to sprawl, our metropolitan planning organizations, politicians, the way we've built our transportation sector, no single person has created this mess. We've done it across the board, and we're having to recognize that we all need to be part of that solution. And likewise, we need to assure that we measure for what we want as a success. Up until now, what most transportation engineers are being asked to do is to provide for keeping traffic moving, levels of service. But if, again, all we do is build one system for one thing to succeed, it fails. We need a beaker, our measurement for the outcomes that we seek. And once we start doing this, we're going to find it's much more economical and it produces much higher and greater results. I think almost everyone on this call is familiar with the work of Jane Jacobs, who was just a beautiful writer. She was not a planner, she was not an engineer or anything, but she had very keen insight of where we're going astray. And I think these words are actually very prophetic about getting us on track. Important to note that Jane Jacobs wrote her great work, Life and Death of Great American Cities, when I was still in high school. So what's the difference? When I came to Florida and started my work, International Drive looked like this. In fact, it didn't even have sidewalks. And this is where we're inviting people from all over the world to see. I don't know if International Drive has been rebuilt, but when it does get rebuilt, it should only have 2 lanes and a center turn lane, not 4. It's a very lethal road construction concept. And hopefully, as we've been able to do in many Florida cities, to start to build around the right size, the right scale, and the right economy to bring back the full vitality of a community. I now live in Port Townsend. This is Port Townsend. And this is one of the prime reasons I moved here when I saw how well people can just get out and walk and bike mostly around the city, and to have really great farmers markets and so on. I said, okay, this is where I want to spend most of my years now approaching retirement, but not retired. Let's build the case now for the health and wellness picture. Very sadly, this is it's still not what we see every day, but I think it's the importance to recognize that we've become pretty bizarre. Pictures that people in other countries can't even conceive why we would have done this. And it may be that more people are going to recognize, now that they can't get fitness in their studios, that they need something that they don't have to go to, and they can just do it on a very natural basis. So in order to achieve this, I want to focus on how we get to where we really want to be. Again, my mantra is that if we design for the oldest among us and then the youngest among us, everyone else is served. This is my grandson, Jack. Probably just days before he would push off on his own and start to walk upright. Jack is now 12 years old, and he's been bicycling very actively for over 6 years. Yeah. Especially Florida should be focused on aging in place, not sending folks off to be institutionalized at young ages because we didn't build the system where they can maintain their health. Most countries of the world, the elders don't have to be institutionalized. This is a huge cost, not only to the families that have to support folks in their older years, but to everyone who ends up paying the health costs. If we can keep people active, this woman who's sitting here the day I photographed her, I assume she was in her mid-90s. But if we build for our elders, then we're reducing the need for levels of medication or medication at all. We're keeping them in a great emotional, mental state, and but they need an active America where they can get out and they can own their street, their neighborhood, their city. And it's true across all spans. Uh, Likely, some of these folks are retired, but the point is they have a wonderful little town they live in where they can get out and be active. As we age, our abilities change. I'm now 76, as I think I mentioned earlier, and the point is it takes me longer to get into a street or out of a street. I can still walk as fast as anyone, but at night I don't see as well, and I could trip. I've fallen twice now outdoors, just as a result of very little imperfections in a sidewalk or whatever. But getting in to and out of a street is a much tougher act. So we need to think through everything we design, whether it's a sidewalk, a trail, a street crossing, how we're going to provide for people of all ages to have that dignity and that ability to go places and be as active as they'd like. It's also affecting our teenagers. We now have reached the point where our youth are more medicated than any time in history. And partly it's just their inability to be active, to engage with others, and again, to have an environment that accepts them. I now work for an organization called Blue Zones. You can check us out on the internet, bluezones.com or .org. And our founder, Dan Buettner, did studies in 5 cities of the world. You'll see him in just a minute. And then came up with the secrets to healthy lifestyles and longevity and happiness, as it turns out. Dan is wrote the article that is the 3rd most read article in National Geographic's history. He's been on 4 covers so far, a 5th one coming, and a significant tie. He and I are tied together in this way. He holds more Guinness bike records than any other human, and likely won't break those records. So about 11 years ago now, he founded Blue Zones. I came to work full time for Blue Zones, and you can check out Dan Buettner's TED Talk. It's now been viewed by mega millions, and get you into more depth on this topic. But what Dan did was to study the places that scientists knew were the places with the healthiest people, healthiest lifestyles, and the highest longevity. In fact, Americans, typically, the average American at least leaves 12 good years of life on the table, unspent, largely because of lifestyles, diet, lack of good, robust activity. You can see it here that about 20% of how long we live is in our genes. We can't go beyond what the genes can allow us for, but why we're leaving those 12 good years of life uncashed is truly we built the wrong environment, and because of the wrong environment, our behaviors are not healthy. We need better access to food, to trails, to everything, and that'll lead us to a more prosperous America. There's a missing photo here. This is meant to be a photomorph, but I want to tell the story of Albert Lee, Minnesota. The street you see laid out in front of you was 5 lanes, and wanting to share with you what we envisioned for Albert Lee. This is a small town, 20,000 population, Albert Lee, Minnesota. And when we went to work with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, they said they would not narrow down the 5 lanes to 2, which is what we held out for. And they said, look, we just want to keep our project on track. We'll come back in 20 years and do that. Because we had worked with Albert Lee, making it a Blue Zones community, the community basically said, no, we don't want your resurfacing until you're going to do it right. In time, Minnesota DOT realized that because the community is working together, that they had to accommodate the community. So this is the change you will see in Albert Lee. As soon as the 5 lanes came down to 2, the truck crashes came down 78% sustained. And obviously it set a better platform for the buildings that you see out in front. And again, this was the first Blue Zone community. Albert Lee, as a result of the whole program, was able to drop their health care costs 49%. And with a large percentage that healthcare now costs, that is a phenomenal change in city operations and county, corporate, whoever's paying the bill. This is the kind of result we all need if we're going to have an economically viable community. We also were able to produce as outcome 3.2 added years across the board for residents of Albert Lee. And again, you can check out more about bluezones.com and see where these figures come from. We're now up to 51 cities for Blue Zones funded projects. And this was one of the earlier ones, Muscatine, Iowa. The road you see here, Mississippi Drive, you can pretty well tell this was not during the coronavirus. This is just ordinary day years ago that they no longer needed their 5 lanes. And because of the frequent flooding now of the Mississippi River, climate change, the city, the railroad now must raise their tracks about 2 feet in order to stay operational. This is a very important line in the rail system in America. So when they do that, then the road has to be rebuilt. We went in and worked with Muscatine, and the road that is now going to be built, hopefully this is going to, oh shucks, it didn't fall in. I'm sorry, but we're going down to 2 lanes, trails will be built, and so on. Now let's shift gears a little bit, and I think you're going to see how the health aspect also is actually the way that we're going to further develop our economy, where things are going to pencil out in the future if we follow this course. It's important to point out some of the stats. The CEOs of America have determined that walkability, that if you can increase your walk score in your community, on average, you're going to increase the value of a property, a home, anywhere from $800 to $1,400 per point. This is a 0 to 100 scale. It's also important to point out that when we build for walking and bicycling infrastructure, we're employing more people at a lower cost overall than when we're building for the automobile. All of these are very important elements of where building trails, building sidewalks, building the whole systems for all forms of transportation are going to lead to a healthier economy. And I want to make my point with some cartooning. So imagine yourself in the 1400s. Can everyone do that? Just pretend that we've gone back to the 1400s. And I'm going to ask everybody, is this a correct view of our solar system, the way we know it? And the answer, of course, is of course. Everything circulates around planet Earth. Well, along come Copernicus, Galileo, and other great thinkers, developers of modern mathematics to say that can't be. The Earth is just one planet that revolves around the sun. But at that time, you would be labeled a heretic if you believe that. So for many, many more years, people continued to believe the old Earth-centric concept. Take yourself back to today, and the question I ask you is this a correct perception of how our economy works? So I'll present a different view. What if building our cities around people is what's really going to drive the economy, certainly the economy of the future? We are now getting a glimpse of how important this is going to be, but I want to build that economic structure through cartooning provided to us by Ian Lockwood. Now let's get into trails, a key part of this presentation, especially for this audience. And I want to point out again what our need will be in the future as we go forward, but we have to help send that message. And it's so important that we get that across. You've seen the stats before, but Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which you see pictured here, they've been at this for well over 30 years. I notice now the homes put eyes on the trail. We're still not doing that enough in Florida, but that's a key component of adding to the value of a person's property, having them feel engaged, interacting, even though those who are on the trail are separated by 100 feet or so. These are the most desired places to rent or to own in Jackson Hole. And I think it's important to point out that there are many pathway benefits. I'm going to go into a string of them here as we do this, but just something as simple as being in nature will boost your recovery times. One might even say it even, certainly through the exercise, keeps your immune system more in tune to ward off a ultimate insult on the body. And also very important that we start this process early on. Trails will do that, where many trails are originally conceived and built for recreation. What we found in Florida is that well over a third of all use of a trail is truly applied to transportation. I think in the future that being connected is going to be one of those elements we most appreciate about trails, that they just give us these natural ways to link in with others, people not always like ourselves, and allow us to understand and appreciate where we fit into society, and to see and understand how rich and complex our population is. Many people who ride, of course, join organizations or clubs, go out on regular events. People who belong to a group tend to pick up the health habits of the people in that group. Bicyclists are among the best positioned to be in what I call the right tribe. We, through Blue Zones, create what we call Moais. It's a gathering of folks who tend to share similar interests, develop friendships that you can always go to in a difficult time in life. But I'm so tuned into the importance of being able to join a group similar folks that are going to be able to allow us to feel connected to our communities. I think it's also important to point out that those who enjoy trails are so much in touch with the natural parts of our environment. So where my interest is to focus on the built environment, and this would be part of it, the trails get us out to where we can appreciate and understand the significance of the wonderful state Floridians live in. Now let's talk a little bit about tourism. Visitors need access not only to the trails, but they need ways to get to the trails. If we're not to build big parking lots at trailheads, we need to have that first mile, last mile, getting to the trail, getting back home or to a shop. And so we need to look beyond the trails if we're to build a strong base for tourism. A lot of studies have been done. Some of the best are from the state of North Carolina, where the knowledge about how much we're increasing property values, increasing the marketability of a property is based on how close or proximate you are to open space, trails, parks, or just natural open spaces. Homes are worth more and they sell faster, and very important to understand these economic aspects. It's also important to point out that, again, the shopper for a house today, mostly millennials, are now looking for something that gives them that natural and the ability to quickly shift gears from driving on some trips to others where we go to the store and shop, or go visit friends, any of a number of things. I think it's also important to point out that this is not new information. We've known a lot about the value of trails going way back into the early 1980s. I used to be a significant follower of the early research, but it's only become more and more documented through really good data. And this is very important for all of us to know if we're to have the capability of working with elected leaders and others to deliver the message that one of the best things that we can be spending our future monies on is to be building sidewalks, trails, and systems for people. It's important to point out too that once we make these shifts, and I think we are seeing this now, less noise, less air pollution, and truly moving those who need to be in autos, reducing the congestion and the delays in their times if we build out the more complete system. Before leaving this topic, I wanted to point out that, and this is very important for Florida, that seniors have 77% of the nation's wealth, 40% of its disposable income, and as we provide for their needs, and again, if we can provide the systems that give them health at a low cost, that we're really in good shape. And Maggie, I know you're on the call. This is a shot I shot in Missoula, Montana, when we were opening a trail there. So again, I want to round out that it's very important what we look at in terms of increasing the value or the yield, and open space, parks, trails are one of the very best ways to rebuild a really sound economy for a community. One of the things they found out by studying the Outer Banks when they built for trails there, that the new tourism that came, the added tourism, gave them an added $60 million annually. Now think about that in terms of Titusville, of Brevard County, of all the parts of Florida, that when we look at the dollar amounts, the return on investment is just phenomenal, how much we add in. And by the way, this whole presentation is being recorded. It is accessible, or will be accessible to everyone. So I want to point out that I've spent a lot of time making sure I was able to document a lot of the things for you to be able to see and share. So, all right, mountain biking also growing in phenomenal levels in Florida is another added, and I want to say low-cost way to use our natural spaces by providing for trails. We essentially are minimizing erosion or human impact on our areas, and that our visitors in the future are going to be looking for things they can do where they're not all crammed together in a Disney World or something like that. So profound effects if we start to build our downtowns, our neighborhoods, and open spaces to where people don't have to be crammed into cars or into large crowds or gatherings. I want to move on, but want to also get across the concept that Disney figured this out in the early years I was working with them, that if they could just hold on to a tourist for an additional day, this was thousands of dollars of additional income. But to do it, you have to have a variety of things that people want, they can come and they can do. And that's another beautiful aspect of building the trail systems and building the full system where people, families of diverse ages can come and feel comfortable and enjoy the economics of a place. So let's focus now on cities that have advanced and point out that realtors are now hearing that out of the many people that they're surveying and selling homes to, that the home buyers today are requesting over and over that bike trails be included in the homes where they live. So, as a general concept, visitors want and need about 5 miles of bike facilities in order to spend that extra day to get out and so on. So I'm hopeful that virtually every community in Florida is going to have at least 5 miles of a fully separated system and one that provides all the amenities for the trails to be used. Shifting gears just slightly, but staying with economics, it's so significant that we return a lot of the open parking lots and other areas of our cities that we overbuilt for the car back to placemaking, to what is really going to drive the energy of the future and give us the return on the investment we make. Most of you on this call already realize that when we go to build anything for people, trails, sidewalks, systems, we're creating more jobs than anything else we do in transportation. And we're doing it in a way that they're easy to maintain and to operate. And again, I want to really get across this whole concept that the more we do for increasing walking, bicycling is going to build profoundly stronger communities. This is Minneapolis. It's the home of our organization. And despite the climate, extreme climate, they now have one of the highest walking and bicycling rates in the nation. And largely because they thought holistically about how to build. When we think about the cost of building for walking, bicycling, or transit, it's important to have this figure in mind, that if people walk and they make an investment in walking, whatever it is, society still has to pick up a small percent, 1 cent. If you bike, it's still amazing. You put in the dollar, society's paying back, or having to pay 8 cents. And if your bus, there's a little higher cost, but still the most affordable. But if you're driving, especially single occupant vehicle driving, you put in the buck, maybe it's in gas, maintenance, whatever. Society's having to pick up the rest of that cost. And this is a very important point to keep in mind. So let's see, if we were to lighten the load, if you live in, well, let's just make up a number, a community of 100,000 population, and you put in the kinds of systems and incentives and rewards for more people to walk, bike, use transit, and you can get rid of having to, as a city, cover the cost of 15,000 cars. People now have more expendable income, and that leaves an extra $127 million per year in the community to circulate in retail stores and all the other things. Very important to understand these statistics. Also important, how we lay out a community, how much open space we create. We now know, and this is pretty reliable across the board, that when we lay out our communities confront on trails, parks, any open space, we generally are increasing the value of a property by 15%. That is huge when it comes to having to cover the costs of infrastructure. A quick question for everyone on the call is to understand the value of a well-positioned park or open space. So I'm asking everyone to take a guess and actually write it in, if you don't mind, what you estimate it would be worth if you could buy an acre on the edge of Central Park. What would you have to pay to acquire that acre? So if you can just write your guesses in. Wait just a moment for that. Here's the figure. 1 acre, if you could acquire it on Central Park, that location, you'd have to pay $647 million just for the lot before you build the building. Some more on economic effects. If we can bring down the speeds, typically Florida has way over designed the streets. We induce speed because we've done that. You'll see some of the reasons for that and later in the presentation. But if you can get the speeds in your own neighborhood down 5 or 10 miles an hour, you're increasing the value of your home, of every home on that block, on that street. So think about that, of how we, number one, design the street, but number two, come back and correctly manage speed. Also important to understand that when we saw the decline in housing prices since the peak just before the Great Recession, we were really starting to measure the value of the walk score. And again, you can see that as we adapt our thinking about how to build communities, we're going to see increased valuation of properties across the board. The EPA did a lot of research on infrastructure costs and returns and found out that it's 47% less expensive to develop a pattern of streets and properties around people than our current conventional development patterns. These are big numbers to be thinking from and working with, and something that I know everyone on this call, whether you're an elected leader or any of the working professions, these are the kind of things you need to have in your kit as you go in and work with a recalcitrant decision maker and really start to bring in what these returns on investment are. So I don't want to overcover any one topic here, but until we can understand and appreciate the importance of how we create jobs of the future, what our output is going to be, then we really aren't in a position to fully grasp it. The orange, I believe it's Orange Blossom Trail in downtown Winter Garden has produced amazing results. We've got great examples throughout Florida of the value of trails and what they contribute to growing the economy of a town. The West Orange Trail, again in Winter Garden, brought in huge numbers of new businesses and really produced the kinds of outcomes that we're going to see very valuable if we can do that in cities throughout Florida. So we have a lot of these as pioneers, but they're in our own state. You don't have to go to Jackson Hole or somewhere exotic in order to show the return on the investments we make. I'm going to broaden that topic though and talk about the whole pattern of city development. And in this case, go to the 2 ways it got built. Portland, Oregon decided to focus on people first, not sprawling. And you can see that over a 10-year period, 1980 to 1990, they actually were able to reduce their property taxes. Atlanta, much more like Florida, went the other route and induced more sprawl. And out of necessity, they had to increase property taxes 22%. Their air quality went down and their neighborhood quality plummeted. So let's take a town. This happens to be Chincoteague in Virginia, a place many people like to go for a short weekend vacation. And so after you see the ponies, you come back through the actual town, Chincoteague. Question I ask is, what's your desire to remain in this town? And if you don't have the right incentive, then this town doesn't pick up that income. But what if that street got rebuilt to be a real place, a place of energy, just like any of the towns in Brevard County could. We can hang on to the tourist dollars longer and obviously make it more desirable to purchase a home and start a business in that area. One of the projects we were able to work on recently is Avon, Colorado. You can see the street on the top left. After we had gone in and taken out the non-essential lanes, we're down to 2 lanes, but now the city realizes they want to be much more focused on walkability. So we gave them several different options. Increase the parking, increase the ease of being a bicyclist, a pedestrian, and start to create place. So there's no single design that we can focus on, but to give some further examples, very sadly, most of, if not a huge percentage of Florida got built next to a stream, oceanfront, or lakefront, like you see on the left. The idea being that if you can have your private property, the developer's going to make more money with that kind of sale. That's just not true. If instead we still have the lakeshore or waterfront properties, but now you've got a public amenity, a trail, and people way back in the community have easy access to that lake or waterfront, all home values go up, and you do not lose the value of the lakeshore properties. So some of our patterns of development have truly cut the returns on investment based on the types of land uses we need. We can look at that on a higher scale. Again, if we follow the current zoning practices for most towns, which is A, we end up with a highly reduced yield per acre, not walkable. You almost are forced to drive there. But if we can shift toward the B, which is mixed use villages, quieter, much more aesthetic, then again, we increase the value of land on average about 800%. And benefit to everyone in the community. So again, all of these images are going to be available to you in the presentation deck. Street connectivity is one of the big things I've been pushing for. If you look at two communities in the same county, Seattle, where the old Seattle got built really well, nicely connected streets, and the cost of delivering services in that portion of Seattle, you can provide just take one service, fire service protection per household, $159 a year, reasonably affordable. But if you go to a neighboring community, Bellevue, Washington, which is laid out in a sprawl pattern where things are disconnected, to provide the same service or protection, then it's $740 per year per household. So I think we can see how important the pattern is. And of course, the pattern on the left is very walkable, very bikeable. Another important study to consider is one that was done in California. They took a number of communities that were well laid out in terms of street connectivity, and then a comparable number that were not, and phenomenal results. So the cities that had really good street connectivity kept the speeds lower and the potential for a crash much lower. You can see the list of cities here. And then comparable cities, again, both in the same state. On the right, these cities were not laid out well, and you can see the phenomenal change. So at the concept, what we're looking at is the better street connectivity we have, the fewer crashes you're going to have, the more walkable, the more bicycle friendly. You can see the actual returns on this slide. And again, really worthy of considering how important it is to get back to the traditional way of building. Fatal crashes come down, crashes overall come down, pedestrian bicycle crashes come way down when we make that consideration. So probably one of the most used images now in training folks on how we should be designing in the future. There was a time when everything we designed was for internal trip capture, where you didn't have to go out to the arterial and tie it up. But then we shifted to a different pattern where everything was disconnected, and we had to go back to the principal road with external trips. What we're now saying is future design of Florida cities, because we're growing, we'll be the first state to prove this, is to go back to the internal trip capture. But we have to change a lot of our policies and practices to get there. One of the important concepts in blue zones, and this is very well documented, is the more we can include in any neighborhood the things people need the most, proximity to parks, to worship centers, schools, some stores, a work center perhaps. What we're really talking about are ideally mixed use neighborhoods. If we can get that life radius more compact, people become healthier. You can see it in this diagram. If we only have a few streets, then it's almost impossible to walk. Every street that you would walk on is going to have more traffic. But if instead we lay out a requirement for block perimeters to support walking, biking, then we end up with a really good pattern like this. The speeds are going to be lower. People are going to have more friends and neighbors. Just that's the way it is. And but we need destinations. So we lay on the third layer on top, and we begin to realize we need the parks. We need trails. We need places to go to if we're going to walk as much as we would like. We've been working from this in concept. Our best planners have known this for years. If we're going to create a center, I always often suggest to me as they start with their downtown that they work outward from there, keep the higher concentration, the compact form at the center and then work out from there. You can even see it with an imaginary scenario. If you as a parent are going to take your child to play soccer, it requires 4 trips. You're not going to stay there the whole time. And on the other hand, same number of rooftops, same amount of commerce, but the scene on the left, you're now going to have the opportunity for walkability and be able to increase the health, the vitality, and it turns out it's a lower cost structure to put in place. I'll go through this one fairly quickly because I'm trying to watch our time, but I want to point out that if we take an example of someone coming home, say they've been on a trip and they need to shop, they've got a place to do it. Then they go home, and in a well-designed neighborhood, once they park the car, now everything else can be done by foot. They go out, play tennis, and you see in the center, this is a green space that serves 2 neighborhoods. And then you decide later you're going to go off and have a nice evening dessert or whatever, and then walk home on the trail. You could do it by bike, of course, and so on. This is what we're talking about. And this is internal street capture. So you don't have to go back to a principal road. All this is done with an internal trip. I think it's an important concept for us to understand of how we can and should lay out our communities of the future. Now moving to the other things we need to add to a neighborhood. So I asked everyone to think through what you would need to do to increase walking, bicycling here. This is a Florida community. And I think almost anyone on the call is going to say, yeah, you have to have sidewalks and put some crossings in, darn it. Well, you're still not going to get a lot of walking or biking. So what else do you add? Green. You make the park a place to come to, a destination. But the key important element that's not in yet, and one that our code often forgets, our town making code, is you have to have eyes on the park. You have to have people living next to the park. And once you put all these in place, then you're going to see a big shift. I want to create a little defense for the concept of more compact form. We call it density, but we may have to share the significance of it in the future when people say, well, if we live in a rural area, we're less likely to get a coronavirus or a future pandemic. It's just not true. If we maintain a healthier environment for everyone, then we need to have a reasonable amount of density. The lower right scene is probably 12 to 14 units per acre, and people are still separated, but yet they have the ability now to have a choice in transportation. We have to have a compact form. And I'll make my point, going back to Vancouver, the gentleman you see in the turquoise jacket is Gordon Price, a 6-time city council member who led the green movement. They went from a moderate density community to one that's fairly high density, and notice where we're standing. After we stood here in the middle of the street with our group to study Vancouver, he said, where's the traffic? And true enough, if people can live with enough compact form, they're going to walk, they're going to bike, and they're going to drive much less. And so while we're there, I said to our group, you know, pair off, ride with someone else, but stop every once in a while and see how many people are walking, how many people are biking, and how many people are driving. And you'll find out that the vast majority of movement, because we built our city for people, is no longer going to be the car. We may need more compact buildings. This is a wonderful example from Monterey, California, another blue zone area that we're working in. This is one building. It was built on 2/3 of 1 acre. I'm sorry, 1/3 of 1 acre. And in that space, we were able to create all the stores you see listed here: coffee house, delicatessen, a 6-screen movie theater, shoe shop, a tarot card reading shop, and 30 studio apartments above. And good, healthy downtowns will be able to build buildings like this and get them to really pencil out. Another thing I'd like to point out on a return on investment to the developer. So this is one of the Blue Zone's original studied communities, Loma Linda, California. The street on top is Mission. And when I helped with the design of this community, we said we need lots of parks, green space, but we have to have the street connection so that the next section that you build, you have that internal trip capture. You don't have to go back to Mission. The interesting thing that got discussed is down on this end, that was the third area that we developed, is a high intensity power line running through there. We felt that if we could build enough homes with enough compactness, the developer could pay for the trails and the park and maintain it. Unfortunately, people came in and they whittled the density down to a level where it had to be turned over to the city. The city had to build the trails. They have to pay for the maintenance because we didn't have enough compact form in order to pay for the full system. So as we now get into the safety aspect, I'm going to first turn to this image of Madison, Wisconsin. They've been building for all modes of transportation for now well over 30 years. And this is a fairly easy photo to take in Madison. So I want to introduce the whole notion of target speed. It's something that engineers have not been taught up until now. And but we need to, from here on out, introduce this in engineering. I think, again, almost anyone on this call realizes you have a choice in at what speed you get hit as a pedestrian or bicyclist. You want 20. You have a very high chance of survival. You just go up 10 miles per hour, exponentially, you're going to decrease the number of people survive and the severity of injuries. It's now essentially a toss of a coin as whether you'll be alive. Another 10 miles per hour, which many Florida streets have induced these speeds, your chance of survival if you get hit as a pedestrian or a bicyclist are now very, very small. So how do we take a scene like this and transform it till we get the speeds correct and move traffic better and build for the economy that we're talking about? So again, if you don't mind, write in and suggest the speed you think most motorists would feel that they should be going on a street like this. Take a pause for you to type that in. But what if we bring a change? And the first change is fairly simple. We basically show the motorists they don't have oceans to drive through. And we can put in the parking, speeds come down even more. We introduce edges, create a sense of enclosure, speeds come down more. Then one of the big ones, we terminate the vista, and you see here. And all of these is in the field of landscape architecture and engineers. That then brings in the development community, the code changes and so on. And now I can guarantee you the speeds here are going to be about 19 miles an hour. I'm going to close out with some success stories. I've had the great opportunity to work with some of the best cities in America, city managers, city planners, city engineers. This street, when we first got there, in this town, University Place, Washington, there was a very high crash rate. You can see the walking conditions are extremely poor. They only had about 1 mile of built environment for walking in the entire town of 30,000. Through our work, working together, we had to keep the same number of lanes, at least for now. But notice how much more inviting walking, bicycling is. We brought down the crashes by making it a people-centric design, 76%, and more people walking, biking, and we set the stage for a new downtown. I think this is very important that we recognize that we're not talking about greatly increasing the cost of a road. We're just saying build it correct from start, and you're going to get the return on investment. In the extreme left side of this is now a Trader Joe's. This area now has a Whole Foods. Again, you can see the completed design, and then a little bit later, what the road looks like. I think it was 9 years transpired from the scene you just saw to this scene. Here's what they were able to do. We put in new roads. As you can see, the one going right through the center is Bridgeport Way, but 2 new roads being built to go from Spraw to a true town center. Another area I'd like to focus on is South Beach. Espanola Way in 1995 looked like what's on the left, but today it looks like this. We redesigned the street to be focused on people, and I think you can see why people would want to go there to socialize, to be part of the process. Another town, Manitou Springs, which is in Colorado. This had been a 4-lane road. We knocked out 2 of the lanes, put in the center lane, as you see, with a new pattern. Businesses just took off like a rocket. This was led by the business community, the Main Street folks. And we were able to do this after a different bypass road had been built, so that those who wanted to go somewhere else didn't have to stop in Manitou. But now Manitou is one of the most popular places and just thriving. I would say my favorite remake of a town is this one. It is Hamburg, New York. We worked in all 3 principal streets running through town that form their downtown, and took out all the traffic signals, put in roundabouts. This one was in a very compact area. You can see other areas. What we did, we knocked down the travel lanes to 10 feet. It's almost universally what I recommend to a town first in order to free up space for parking, for bicycles, whatever. The areas you see marked out in a coral color are not bike lanes. We just couldn't pull up enough physical space, but we brought the speeds down to about 19 miles an hour, just at or above bicycling speed. We vastly increased the number of people who walk, who bike, who come down and shop. Sales went up over 30% in all the stores, and the town went from pulling 9 building permits per year to 99 per year. What a success story. I also like to say that if we can visually make it feel like it's even less than it is, visually it feels like it's 9 foot wide. It's actually 10. You can see how it works. Even if you have an unusual event where a big truck has to park to make a delivery, other trucks get through. The truck drivers actually love it. They no longer have to stop. They go slow, but they really don't have to stop. Pedestrians, again, you can see, have short crossing distance. They don't have to wait for signals, and everything works better. Another community we worked in is Bird Rock. It's in San Diego area. This is the road before. People were speeding 35, 40, even 50 miles an hour was common. And we took out all the signals of the stop sign and converted to, I think it's 7 roundabouts now. And the businesses, again, took off like a rocket. We slowed the speeds down to 19 miles an hour steady. And because no one needs to stop, again, people get home sooner. It's applying the right tools to make an area work. Again, La Jolla, you can see the before and then the after. This is what I'm wanting to get across when I say design for people first. The car ends up being one of the great benefactors of this, but certainly retail. Fort Lauderdale by the Sea, this had been a 4-lane road. You can see now the speeds come down. The prudent driver sets the speed. It's a safer street, typically 20, but as high as 70% reduction in all crashes, more walking, more biking. West Palm Beach, Florida. This used to be 3 lanes. Think about how long we had to have to set the signals for people to cross 36 feet. Now it's only 20. And I'm going to close out with how we get there. And this, I think, is a very important image and story to go with it. It is Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And you might say, well, they've got a sidewalk. Yeah. They don't have sidewalks on the side where people live. So Michigan DOT went in. They were willing to pay for new sidewalks. Over 300 people came to the meeting that night to oppose the sidewalk. They felt that they looked rural without sidewalks, and to have a sidewalk, they look urban, and they killed the whole project. That's where we are in America today. We're conflicted. And so we've been inventing public engagement strategies where we can now get people to come and be effective in their output, take ownership, and allow us to move a project forward. Sammamish Public Works Director was told it would take 10 years to go from concept to concrete. With a great public engagement process and some other wonderful things he was able to do, he had the bulldozers moving within 300 days by going through a good process and getting a good system underway. The process we use is very carefully thought through, but it's inclusive. It's what we call informed consent. We present a portion of what you saw today. We do walking audits, and some communities we add to bike audits and so on. But the point is we give the opportunity for the entire set of stakeholders to take part. This is the one you see that we did for Bird Rock, the story we told. But the point is people need to become informed and know why they would back a certain idea and develop the strategies to move their community forward. We're in a tough place in America today. We've been building one way, the wrong way. And it's going to take a while to better inform people, to get them to understand why they need something. This is a fun story. I saw when I was going through this neighborhood that people were out building their own trail, and went to find out how this came to be. Their county was broke. They wouldn't build a trail. Actually, it started with the street. This county couldn't maintain the street. And so the people not be able to get mail or to enjoy their neighborhood formed a nonprofit, went out, repaired the street, fell in love with working together, and then decided that from then on out, on weekends, they'd go out and they do really wonderful things for the community. So getting down to the final story is Rex Burkholder put this bench out knowing that he lived in a community where people took walks. He wanted it to be inviting. One day he got a letter in the mail from someone, and it was tear stained. And Rex, as he read the letter, began to cry. The letter essentially read, I want to thank you for the bench. My friend of many years just died, but he held on to his dignity to the very end. He could still walk, he could still shop and go places on his own. And it was your bench that allowed him to rest on the way to the store, on the way back. And now to start raising our children in a way that they understand design from the get-go. I was in Bend, Oregon, saw these children with clipboards. Every once in a while they'd stop in a group, they'd draw. I was so curious about this. I went up to one of the adults. I said, what are the children doing? She said, Dan, these children are learning how to design a city. We start early, and I think we'll get where we want to be. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to turn over for any remaining minutes we have to say. I lived in Florida for 32 years. You get to live there and build the trails, build the systems we forgot to build. We have a great future ahead of us, but we need to take the energy of this pandemic and what we're going to be able to grow out of it. But don't miss this opportunity. And with that, I'm going to turn it back. Sarah or Aaron, one of you two folks.
Thank you, Dan. That was a wonderful presentation. We did have 3 questions in the chat box. Aaron, I know you had tagged them. Do you want to hop on and read them since you pulled them?
Sure. Hey, Dan, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really, really a lot of great information. We really appreciate your time today. So we have a question from River to Sea. What advice can you give our group that has the goal to reshape our region after COVID? What resources are available to us?
Great question. Well, first of all, to focus on building for those projects that are going to build the greatest number of jobs and things that we can afford and can sustain long term. Just after Obama got elected, they were trying to kickstart the economy, and they took what they called shovel-ready projects. Sadly, unfortunately, most of the projects that were shovel-ready were just building more of the bad stuff. Today, we're a little more advanced. We've got more plans ready to go in Florida, and we can be building the trails. We can completing the sidewalk gaps, building healthier downtowns. So I think this round of transportation monies, once they're identified and go forward, we're going to have the kinds of support that we need to build a better community. But we as local communities or the regions have to make sure the monies get spent on the things that are important to the community and stop building the things that are just going to worsen the problems.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Our next question is from Deborah. She says, Dan, are there resources to review for state arterials to retrofit for people instead of vehicles?
Yes, and the good news is Florida has been thinking about this for a long time. Billy Hadaway, a name that many of you will recognize, a very high level person, now transportation director in Orlando, was very key to working through the Florida DOT to build the best new design guides, get complete streets embedded, and many of the other steps for building the things we need in the future. It's important at the state level to key in on this and not go back and use old standards that are going to worsen the problems. But yes, Florida is very well positioned. It's also possible for each community in Florida to adopt new street design guidelines. The NACTO, it's called. Many of the top city builders in North America have now adopted their own, written and adopted their own street design guide that could be adopted by a community. But yes, the documents are out there for our communities to adopt the right design guides.
Awesome. And the third question we have is from Jason. He asked, how does a city develop the political will to find more developers interested redeveloping areas within cities and reject building huge housing develops across the interstate with no transit access that requires driving?
It's one model project at a time. And again, fortunately, so many places in Florida have learned to do it right. So we have the data to show the return on investment. Working with one really good developer at a time. The thing that developers need is a level playing field. So if one developer to go out and do the right thing, they're going against the tide. They have to fight political structure, status. But if the community can adopt the policies, the practices that are going to help rebuild correctly, then all developers are on that same level playing field. Things can go faster. We can incentivize. If you're a developer that wants to build our new model, you're going to get these added incentives. You're going to make more money. We're going to reduce the length it takes to go through the process to get you approved. Right now, we're approving the bad stuff, and we're making it very hard to build the good stuff. We need to reverse that.
All right, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to everyone for attending today. Once again, we would like to recognize our sponsors, the City of Titusville, Playlanda Brewing Company, Florida American Planning Association, Atlantic Coast Section, Titus Landing, Lisa Mosier with Coldwell Banker, Coast Realty, Wild Ocean Market, Bike Florida, Days End by Wyndham, Coldwell Banker, Coast Realty, Titusville Area Chamber of Commerce, St. John's River to Sea Loop Alliance, Space Coast TPO, and the Florida Office of Greenways and Trails. And of course, another thanks to Dan Burden for joining us and providing his amazing insight and presentation. The next week's presentation will